Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Sauerman here, and what I've created for you to look at today is some slides that talk about remembering and also honoring the events that happened on September 11th of 2001. What I would love for you to do is, as you're kind of looking at this, I would like you to jot down a question that you might have for your teacher, and at the end of it, ask them. And teachers, if you can answer it, that's awesome. If you can't, direct them to me or Mr. Ophilt, and we'll do our best to kind of answer these questions. This is a really important day in history that molded things that happen in the future, even still to this present day. And so it's really important that we learn about this and learn about the effects and impacts it have. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about what happened. I'm going to give you the specifics. I'm going to then talk to you about who and why they did it. And then I'm going to end with some impacts. How did this affect the United States afterwards? And I think you're going to notice some things in the impacts, and you're going to realize that that came from the events of 9/11. So September 11th, 2001, what happened that morning? First of all, it was a pretty normal morning. There was nice weather. It was a regular Tuesday. People went to work as normal. Little did we know that the events that would happen that morning would shape the United States history for the next 20 some years. We're already 20 years, almost 20 years away from September 11th, 2001. At 8:45, an airplane crashed into the North World Trade Center building in New York City. Here's a picture of after the plane had crashed. Obviously, there wasn't like cameras filming, so we don't have that one on camera hitting it. It hit about the 80th window. Hijackers took it over the same way they did with the other planes, using box cutters and basically taking over the kind of cabin of the plane. They purposely picked flights that were going from the East Coast to California so that the plane had the most amount of fuel on it, or gas, so that when the planes crashed, they would cause the biggest explosion, and also letting gas into the building where it could cause the most damage possible. When this happened at 8:45, it was largely believed to be a complete and horrific accident, but we would soon find out that that's not true. At about 9:03, there was a second airplane that struck the South World Trade Center building. So the first one you can see was already hit. Obviously, there was cameras on it, and there's actual video footage of the second plane hitting the South Tower, causing massive explosions. Once again, this one was a plane full of fuel. Obviously, everyone on board and the hijackers were all killed instantly. At 9:45, there was a third plane, and that struck the Pentagon. This was in Washington, D.C. It was not in New York City. They struck the Pentagon because that is where the U.S. Department of Defense is, which is where the leaders of the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, Marines, all those things are. It was a direct attack against the U.S. military and specifically the leaders. About 15 minutes later, the South Tower, the tower that was hit second, collapsed. And this was, I think, the moment where it got bad and it went to worse. As you can see, there's smoke and fire and dust and smog that went everywhere. It completely engulfed the area of New York City, but New York City itself. And this whole time, this hour before it fell, people are trying to get out and save their lives, and not a lot of people did. If you were below the crash site, you could try to run down the stairs the whole way, but these are 60, maybe 80 floors they tried to get out of, and everyone's trying to get out at once. Obviously, the people that were at the impact zone probably didn't make it. The people above that had no way of getting down, and there's a lot of reports of people running to the top just to have fresh air and having to make some really hard decisions after that. At 10:10, there was a fourth plane that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. It's widely believed that the passengers that were hijacked on the plane retook the plane from the hijackers. There's even some video, or it's not video, there's auditory evidence of these people on the plane calling their loved ones, saying that someone took over the plane and that they're going to take it back from them. And we believe that they were successful. But in taking back over the plane, caused it to crash and spin out of control. And there's some video or there's some audio of people saying like, we know we're going to die. We just need to get this plane back. By 10:10, they had heard of the other events that were going on, and their loved ones were filling them in, and it's very, very scary for everyone involved. And it's why they believe that they knew they were going to die, and so they would rather, not hurt people with this plane rather than, and they landed in a field in Pennsylvania. At about 10:30, the North Tower collapsed, and this is kind of an aerial footage of after both towers had gone down, and you can just see these are massive buildings. You can see the smoke and dust and fire and flames that totally engulfed this part of New York City. It was a completely devastating and horrific event that happened in New York City and the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania, that this was global news. People from all over the world were tuning in to what was happening to the United States. And you can see this picture here of New York City afterwards. You can see just how much effect it had on New York City alone, and the people that died and tried to save lives, and an absolutely horrific event. So much so that 3,000 people roughly lost their lives within a couple hours, from 8:45 to 10:30, less than 2 hours. All this happened, and the world was shook. It was a moment where you felt safe, you felt like it was a regular morning, to what's happening. I've sent a video to your teachers, and your teachers have the option of playing that right now. It shows kind of some incidents of that morning. You can hear the news reporters watching the second plane hit. You can see the buildings crashing. You can hear the fear and terror in people's voices. And I think it's good to watch so that you know what it was like to be there that day. It's a really important day in U.S. history. And if your teachers like to play that, now is a really good time to play it and ask questions. So who did this? There's an Islamic terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. They very similar to what we know as like ISIS today. They are all over Middle Eastern countries. Most of the hijackers actually had lived in Saudi Arabia, or some of them even lived in the United States. They were trained pilots. Like I said before, they hijacked a plane using box cutters. They snuck onto the plane. And this was all a huge event that was led by Al-Qaeda and their leader, Osama bin Laden. There's a picture of him right there. That flag might look familiar because there's other Islamic terrorist groups that use a very similar flag that we see today, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So why? Why did this Islamic terrorist group, why did Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda want to kill all those people and do that? There's a couple reasons, and I don't know if there's any right one. Largely because the United States and other Western countries, and by that I mean like countries in Europe, had military presence in the Middle East before this. There was American troops and wars and other people involved in the Middle East that they didn't want there. There was past wars that happened that left hard feelings, and these people really, really, really hating the United States and other European countries that were basically involved in their business. So they didn't like it. Another reason is that they used the Islamic religion as a weapon, as something dangerous. And I want to make this really important right now to you, that almost every person who's Islamic or is Muslim, they are peaceful and their religion practices peace. But there's small groups of these people that preach that in order to be a true Muslim, you're going to use that and hurt people, especially people who aren't Muslim. And there are Muslims in the United States, but there's also a lot of Christians. And, they even said, we're doing this, we're having a religious war against America. They really hated America. And there's even been instances of groups like ISIS and things using the Islamic religion as a weapon of fear, when in almost every case, it preaches peace. And yeah. So one thing I want to cover quick is that there was a lot of men and women who risked their lives that day to save people. There was firefighters running into the building, running into the burning and collapsing towers to save as many people as they could while everyone's trying to get out. Not to mention the police officers and paramedics that put their life on the line trying to save people at the crash site and at ground zero right where this happened, or tried to get people out of the rubble for weeks after the events happened. And it was truly devastating and emotional for the New York City firefighters, police officers, and paramedics. 400 of them roughly lost their lives trying to save people. And it's a truly heroic moment for these men and women that put their life on the line to save people in a time of panic and terror. So what kind of impacts did this have? Well, the first thing it did was instantly cause a sense of vulnerability. During that morning, there was a sense of, not feeling safe in the United States. And compared to other countries around the world, it's a very safe country to live in. But in that day, it felt like we were weak, and it felt like we were open to attack from other countries. It did lead to some wars, two of them in particular. It led to the war in Afghanistan in 2001. The leaders of Afghanistan was a group called the Taliban, and the Taliban and Al Qaeda were kind of similar. They're both Islamic military groups that use the Islamic religion, not in a good way. They preach violence and things like that. And they had said that they had been hiding, or they knew where Osama bin Laden was. And the U.S. government said, well, you need to give us Osama bin Laden. They said, no, you don't have any evidence he did anything. And Osama bin Laden was hiding in between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is this country here. It's really mountainous. There's lots of caves and stuff like that. And he was hiding and running and things like that from U.S. military forces. We invaded Afghanistan in 2001. About 2 months later, we took the Taliban out of control, but we did not bring our troops home, even though, we had kind of gotten rid of the Taliban in Afghanistan, because there was still more terror or more terrorists in the Middle East that the war was against. It wasn't against a specific country. We created the Homeland Security, which is who controls now our immigration policies and our airport security and threats in the United States against terrorism and things like that. That was created because of that. There was an economic kind of crash, especially in New York. It cost $100 million just to clean up Ground Zero itself. Roughly $60 billion were lost to New York City because of what happened. People losing their jobs, people's family members died, people, had to rebuild their businesses. It was a huge economic burden, especially to New York. It then caused the war in Iraq in 2003. There was a really bad dictator called Saddam Hussein there. He thought to have ties to Afghanistan and Iran, especially the Taliban and Al Qaeda. He was not good to his people. He was especially not good to the people of Kuwait, tried to invade it. And us and other countries like Great Britain saw Iraq as a rogue state and saw that he was supported by all these bad people. And it was thought that he had weapons of mass destruction. Well, turns out some of that information wasn't true. Turns out we couldn't find those weapons, but it caused another war and more troops going to Iraq and them not leaving for a long time. Talks a little about airport security. You used to be able to walk in, buy a ticket, and go to the gate and get on your airplane. Now you have to be to the airport 2 hours early, and you have to get your bag checked, and you can't have more than this amount of liquid, and you have to get your body scanned. And it finally put precautions on. If you can take something like a plane and turn it into a weapon like these guys did, then there has to be massive amount of security before people get on the plane. And that's a direct effect of it. There's also a large anti-Muslim feelings in the United States. People that had lived in the United States, born in the United States for their whole life, who were Muslim and were getting discriminated against because they were Muslim or they wore a turban, just like those guys did at 9/11. And the amount of hatred that they got after these events was huge. And as Americans, we had to relearn, and we had to say, this isn't them. Most Muslims are peaceful, and they preach peace and tolerance. And this is just a small radical group of people that think that other religions are awful and that the only way to solve the problems is through death and violence. And that is not what the Muslim religion preaches. I want to be clear on that. I would also argue that it created groups like ISIL and ISIS and Boko Haram, groups that we're dealing with today, because of United States and European involvement in countries like Afghanistan and Iran, Iraq, Syria, especially Israel, Libya, other forces being involved in there, and these people not wanting them there and starting these radical Islamic groups that are hurting people and killing people in Africa and in the Middle East, mostly because they don't want other countries involved in their business, and they're doing it in a violent way. It's kind of a stretch. It's 20 years later, but I really think that it has an impact on it. If that wouldn't have happened that day, maybe things in the Middle East would have been different. I don't know. One thing it is it's what we call a flashbulb memory. It is a memory that most people remember exactly what they were doing. And I really hope that your teacher talks about what they were doing that morning. And what I really hope you do is you go home and talk to who's ever at home about 9/11, and you ask them, what were you doing? How did you find out it happened? And how did it make you feel? And there are some very powerful moments and feelings that existed that morning. I was in second grade, and I remember specifically what happened that morning and how I felt. And I was so young. There are some teachers I've talked to that remembers every single kid in their classroom and where they were exactly sitting, because a flashbulb memory is something where it makes you feel so emotional that you remember almost every detail about what happened and what was going on. I really would like your teachers to talk with you about this. I want you to ask them questions. I want you to get clarification that you need. I think it's good that you listen to songs that were written about 9/11. I think it's good that you look at some pictures. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there about it. Just be aware that some of it is really graphic. It was a horrific day in United States history. And I'd recommend talking with your parents or your grandma, grandpa, who's ever at home, and asking them, what happened that morning, and let them talk and you listen. And if you have those and you want to share those with me, I would love to hear what they had to say. I think it's something that it's really important we talk about, and it's something that really affected our history, especially if you're listening to all those impacts that we just had. So teachers, now is the time where you can lead discussion. You can let kids talk. You can watch some videos or look at some pictures. And if you have any questions that you can't answer, I look them up or shoot them to me, shoot them to Mr. Oppelt, and we'll do our best to answer any questions that you have. I like talking about this stuff because it's important we learn about it, and it's important we know what happened, why, and the impacts of it. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for listening.